What's up, gangsters? I am right back at you with yet another update on the Accurate Miniatures 1/48 scale b-25b Mitchell project. I just had a lot of momentum going after I got the thing to the primer stage. If you watched the last episode, and you know what, momentum is only good if you take advantage of it. So I have been carrying on. This episode is pretty long. It's like an hour. But I covered a lot of ground because basically I'm taking it all the way from the primer stage to where the bottom surfaces of the thing are all the way into panel line washes. So there's lots to say there, and I hope you guys will find it informative. Check it out. Okay, so picking up pretty much right where I left off at the end of the last episode of this adventure. I've got this thing primed in Badger Stynylrez polyurethane acrylic primer. And as you can see, I've got it primed in black on the top surfaces and white on the bottom surfaces. And the reason that I'm doing that is because what I intend on doing for these lower surfaces is a sort of a hybrid pre-shading method. I'm sure that you guys are all familiar with sort of the standard pre-shading method where people are airbrushing all along panel lines and then painting over that. I don't particularly care for that look. I don't think it's very realistic. And the alternative that I do think produces a much greater degree of realism is black basing. And that's where you prime in black and then you paint really small in random patterns to give to start building tonal variation into the color coat, and then come over the top of all that with a top coat of your base color that's thinned quite a bit so that you can see that tonal variation that you've built in underneath when you do it right. And that's something that you guys can see if you look at Doug's models. He's a real champion of that method, and he does a much better job of explaining it than I do on his blog and on his channel. But obviously, I'm not black basing here because I've primed this in white. And the reason is because I don't particularly feel like black basing is necessarily the best technique for the belly of an aircraft. A part of what creates all of that tonal variety on the top surfaces of these planes is sun fading, foot traffic, dirt, all those kind of things. And that just doesn't happen to the same degree on the bottom of an airplane than it does on the top. But I don't want to do the sort of standard pre-shading. So I'm in a little bit of a quandary if I want to create some tonal variety in the medium gray that's going to be all over the bottom of this aircraft. So what to do? My strategy is one that I've tried before on some other things, and that is I'm going to darken just the panel lines by using a wash, so that when I come back with my color coat, that what will happen is that those dark panel lines will show through as a darker shade of gray. And I think that'll work really good, and it'll provide me with a sort of a base for all of that panel lining. But I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. First of all, let's just talk about the finish that we've got here on this primer. Now, I think that Stynylrez is the best acrylic primer on the planet. It's like 90% as good as an old school lacquer primer, and which makes it really good. And you're going to see part of the reason why I think that right here. Take a look just at the finish that I've got. Just sprayed. This is sprayed straight out of the bottle. I spray with my Iwata HPTH, which has a big fat 0.5 millimeter needle in it. And I spray at anywhere from 28 to 30 psi. And you can see that this stuff lays down satiny smooth. It's kind of weird because when it's going on, a lot of times it looks like it's not going on so smooth, but you look at it 5 minutes later and it's just leveled out beautifully. So you can get, hopefully, a really good look at the quality of the surface on that. Now, I could probably stop right there and be just fine with it, but when you look at this through a magnifier, you will see that there is just a little bit of texture there, and that's going to be true with pretty much any flat paint. And I'm a firm believer in working the paint along the way so that what I end up with is a nice smooth color coat. The problem with texture is that it just compounds itself. If I have little tiny bumps here on this surface, and I then come and I spray my color coat, and maybe I get a few more tiny little bumps, and then maybe I come with a layer or two of varnish and I get a few more tiny little bumps, plus I'm piling on top of all of the bumps that were there before, what I end up with is a bumpy surface that is pretty much going to be visible to the naked eye, and I absolutely do not want that to happen. So what I like to do is, if there's a little bit of texture, then I will go ahead and start working that early in the process, and that's what I'm going to show you here. What I've got is this is a sanding sponge. I think this one came from Micromark, and this is a 320 grit sponge that's pretty new, so it cuts well. I'm going to use it dry. If I were doing a lot of real serious sanding and this was a lacquer primer, I'd probably sand wet. But for what I'm doing here, I really don't need to, because I'm not going to be doing that much sanding, as you'll see. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort of show you this on a small section. And I'm going to just rub this. And I do a lot of this sanding with an Optivisor on my face, because there's just no substitute for being able to see that texture up close while you're working on it. And it also shows you pretty quickly if you burn through the primer, as I just did in that one spot right there. But that's not a big deal, and I'll explain that in a second. Let's take a look at what we're getting here. Okay, now take a look at that section that I've just sanded there. Okay, you can already see, if I can get the right angle on this, you can already see the difference in the surface finish there. Hopefully that'll show up on camera. It looks like it is. You can already see that surface finish is already starting to get a little bit of a sheen to it. Now, why am I not worried about this spot that I burned through? Because that is just going to be a random occurrence of tonal variation that might show through in my color coat, and I like that. That's what I'm working towards, so I don't mind those at all. And I'm not worried about the paint sticking to them. Okay, now that I've done a little bit of sanding there, and actually before I move on, I want to show you something else with this. Let me do just a little bit more here and show you this before I wipe it off. Okay, see right there where see that dust that's come up from the sanding? That's what you want a primer to do. If your primer won't do that on a daily basis, then it's just not a good primer. If you don't need for your primer to do that, because look, not every job requires this kind of finishing work, then that's cool. But in order for it to be considered a competent primer, it's got to be able to dust up like that under normal dry sanding. And that's just, as far as I'm concerned, kind of just the basic minimum requirement of a good primer. You can really see that now, where that's started to get a little bit of sheen to it. You can see the difference between that panel on the front there and the panel on the back. Now, the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take this. This is one of my favorite finishing tools. This is a piece of 4/0 steel wool, and I'm going to just give that a good rub. Not going to spend a lot of time at it, because I don't want to burn through the primer any unnecessarily, but this steel wool will put a nice velvety sheen on that. And what I try to do is go across the grain of my sanding operation to take out any of those micro scratches that may be there. Okay, now you can definitely see that sheen now. See the difference between where I've worked it and where I haven't worked it. Let me get in close. You can really see the difference there. See that pattern of sort of micro scratches? Real tiny fine scratches there. Those aren't going to show up. What those are going to do is be traction for the color coat, but yet still leave me with a nice smooth surface that'll have a very slight sheen to it, which is nice because there's nothing worse in my opinion with to get down to the end of a paint job and find that you've got all kinds of goobers and texture and so forth in it that really ruin that effect. So there we go. That's what I'm going to do to all of the primer on both sides of this wing. So I'm going to work on that now, and then we'll come back after I get done with that and talk about the next step. Okay, now a couple of things that I was thinking about as I was working on this. You can see that I've got all of this bottom and the top surface all pretty well rubbed out. And as I was talking about, I've got some areas where I had burned through these because there were some actual physical defects in there that I needed to give a little more effort to. But again, I'm not going to paint back over those. I'm going to keep those as just random patches of tonal variance. Because I can allow those to show through as much as I want to in my color coat, just depending on how heavily I spray. Now, that might not be appropriate for every aircraft, but for a beat-up old World War II bomber, I think that it's a pretty cool way to start building, the layers of wear and tear that showed on those paint jobs. Now, there are areas that you've obviously got to pay special attention to. That are tough to get to, and that's places like these wing roots next to the engine nacelle. Now, Stynylrez really is pretty good about not dusting, but there's something about airflow that, especially with lacquer primers, will cause you to get some dusting in these corners like this. And when you've got to come back and deal with that, what I like to do is take a piece of sanding sponge and just cut it to a nice shape and put it in my gripper tweezers. And then that gives me a soft tool that will conform to surfaces pretty well, but that I can get down in an area like that and work a corner if I need to. And you can cut those to be whatever size is necessary for the situation that you've got at hand. Now, another thing that I was thinking about is I think that it's real easy to just fall into the trap of only depending on your eyeballs to gauge how well you're doing in your sanding and your finishing work. But you should use your other senses as well. Obviously, your sense of touch is a good thing. You should be able to tell the difference between a nicely smoothed surface like this that's had this sort of treatment that I've shown you guys, and a surface that hasn't. I mean, even with my fingers not having good sensation, I can tell the difference between this area that hasn't been worked on and this area that has been worked on. Another thing is using your ears. Now, listen to this. Listen to that. See how that sounds kind of crusty? That's that rough texture. Now listen to it as I work it. You notice how the sound changes as it gets smoother, and you can see all that dust there where I've worked that surface down, and I've essentially gotten rid of that sort of crust of little tiny bumps on top of that area right there. So just a little, just a little something that's not necessarily intuitive that you can think about as you're working these areas and doing your finishing work, is just to pay attention to all of the information that's coming in that will help you determine how effective your efforts are. Okay, so hopefully that all made sense. Now let's move on to the next part, and that's going to be where I put a wash on these panel lines. And what I'm going to do, how I'm going to do that is with this Tamiya panel line wash, which happens to be dark brown. Now, I don't care too much that it's brown. It's dark enough, and it's going to be underneath a layer of paint that the exact shade doesn't matter too much. So I'm not too worried about that. It's a nice dark color, and it's an enamel, and that's what I want, because what I'm after is getting it to flow along these panel lines and fill in these areas without me having to apply it to the entire surface and just make a big mess. So let's see if we can, let's see here. It's a little tough on this white surface, but maybe if I do it right, we can zoom in there and we can see kind of how it's going to work. Okay, so what I do is I just pick a spot, and hopefully, there you go, you can see that where it's starting to fan out there. Now, if I have some areas where it's spreading out more, that's not a big deal, because again, most of this is going to be gone. And what I'm after is just getting a nice thick distribution of it in those panel lines. And if there's some random areas where it's heavier than others, that's okay. That's not a big deal, because again, aircraft surfaces do not weather uniformly over their entire surface. So I don't want every single rivet head and every panel line section to be exactly the same. What I'm after is just enough that hopefully they will show up underneath that color coat. Now, if they don't, that's no big deal, because I'm probably going to come back and do some more of this on top of the paint as well, to get the final effect that I'm after. This is just kind of laying the groundwork, just starting to build things up. I like to think about this kind of like working on a photograph in Photoshop, where I work in layers to hopefully build up to a final effect that does, that does what I want it to do. And my friend Carlos Mendez and I were talking about this yesterday, in fact, that part of doing that is that you have to be willing to let things look shitty along the way. And sometimes, that's a challenge, because it can be tough to allow yourself to be comfortable with that. But it's definitely an important, I'm not going to say skill to learn, but just kind of an important mindset to learn, to just allow yourself to let things not look perfect along the weathering journey. Because if If you try to control every single thing, then there's a pretty good chance that it's going to look like that's what you tried to do when you get to the end. And again, weathering is a natural process. It's chaos that happens within a pattern. And recreating randomness is something that is sort of difficult for human brains to do, because I'm sure you guys can relate to this. We tend to think of things as in a more orderly way, and we like for things to be that way just inherently. So it's real easy to fall into a trap of trying to control this stuff too much and ending up with an effect that looks like you did exactly that. Something that if you haven't worked with these enamel washes, something that if you could see it off camera here, that you would notice me doing every so often is I'm kind of shaking the bottle a little bit. Enamel washes are fantastic because the mineral spirits carrier lets them flow so well, but one thing that happens with them that's kind of annoying is that the pigments settle to the bottom real quickly, and you'll find as you're working that your application becomes less dense as time goes by, and that's because you're just losing the density of the pigment as it settles down to the bottom of the container. So it's just one of those things you just have to kind of stay on top of and account for as you're working. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up working on this, and I will show you here in a few minutes what the result will look like. Okay, it's been about an hour, and you can see that this is all dried up nicely, including the cat hair right there that I left in for flavor. And I am ready to rub this back. Now, one thing about removing washes is, especially with enamels, is that if you are having to rub too hard, or if the thing that you're rubbing with is too wet, what it's going to do is actually reactivate the material that's down in the grooves, and it's going to pull that back out, and you're going to basically have to go back and do it again. You're going to undo all that lovely work. And so you just have to sort of figure out a technique, and I'll be honest, it's taken me a while to get to where I don't, end up having to do it 2 or 3 times. And there's no perfect way. You just have to fiddle with it. But this is one place where having a glossy finish actually does help. You'll hear a lot of people ask about this. Do I need to have a gloss finish for doing washes? And the answer is not as a general rule, because it depends on the effect you're after. But for panel line washes, it definitely helps. People seem to think that it helps make things flow better, and maybe it does. But I would say that the proof against that is exactly what I've done right here. This, as you saw before I did the sanding work, was a perfectly flat finish. And obviously when I sanded it, I didn't sand down inside those grooves, but you saw the enamel panel line wash flowing pretty easily. Where that smoother finish is going to help, though, is right now when I go to wipe that off, because it's going to require less effort than it would if it were soaked into a flatter finish. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I've got some mineral spirits here, and I'm going to just get some on this Q-tip and put a little bit on this rag, because I just don't want much. I want only enough to reactivate the stuff that's on the surface and get it to come loose. So that's why I'm taking this minimalist approach. So now what I'm going to do is, and you really can't screw this up because you can always redo it. And that's another advantage of working on this stuff early in the process, is not only are you building up layers of flavor, but you're giving yourself plenty of safety net in case things don't go the way that you want it to. So anyway, here I go. I'm going to just start working this, and you know, some people say go with the airflow. That's fine. I don't, you know, for this it doesn't really make much difference because it's going to be so subtle anyway. After I put the color coat over the top of it. So again, what I'm trying to do is just be real light-handed with this, and not have to do a lot of scrubbing, and also not worrying too much about doing it perfectly and making it real uniform. Because again, random is the name of the game. And you can see that we're getting a pretty random effect. So that's what's happening. That's what's up. Is it's obviously not going to leave a huge amount of pigment in those panel lines, but hopefully enough that that it'll show up when I lay on the color coat. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this part, and then come back and we'll take another look at it. Okay, so there we go. That's kind of what I'm after. And I actually had already done the other wing before I even got started on this one. And you can see how it's turned out. I got actually a little better effect on this one. My enamel clung to the insides of the panel lines a little bit better. But I have also done something else on some of these that you may notice. If you look right here, you'll see that there's a little bit of difference in this area. Now what that is I also like to use inks for panel line washes and other washes at times. And this is the stuff, Winsor & Newton. This is black Indian ink. And it's mixed up with some alcohol thinners, UMP in this case. And you can see about how much liquid is in there, not much. And this black ink is super powerful stuff. If you look, you can see how much what kind of coverage you get. And this is literally me taking my stirring stick and poking it into the jar of ink a couple of times and stirring it around in this in the alcohol that's in this little cup. And it behaves quite a bit differently. It tends to act more like a stain than a wash, in that it doesn't flow as well. But it does provide some different effects, and since I want random, I'm gonna use it to do some of that in different places. Again, it may be too subtle to show up when it's all said and done, but that's okay. That's just part of the journey. Now, what you'll notice about this stuff is that it doesn't flow nearly the same as the mineral spirits based stuff does. It tends to cling a little bit more. And again, because it's got an alcohol thinner in it that acts a little bit on the surface of this acrylic polyurethane primer, it is going to, it's going to soak in and stain a little bit more. But you'll see that even though it looks pretty horrible right here, that it will come off of there fairly well here in just a little bit when it gets dry. And again, it won't come off completely. It'll leave a bit of a stain, but that's okay for this purpose. And I often use it for exactly that reason, because it does sort of soak into the surface of an acrylic paint and produce that staining effect. Because sometimes that's exactly what I want in order to create a sort of an overall grimy effect. So I'm going to work on this a little bit and come back to it when it's dry and show you how I rub it back. Okay, now here we go. This has had enough time to dry. It doesn't take very long at all with the alcohol thinners in there. And what I will do is I'll just get a Q-tip like this, and I'll just get it in my mouth for a second there, and just put a little bit of spit on the end of it. Hopefully not the end that had mineral spirits on it already. And just start working that off. I don't know what it is about spit, but it seems to work pretty well at this without being so liquid that it just washes the stuff right back off. So I'm going to just now work at this for a while and get most of that rubbed back, and then we'll take a look at it again. Okay, now one thing that I want to show you is that you can do yet another operation to sort of bring out the contrast here, and that is to come back with the steel wool, because again, that's going to help you burnish away some of what's on the surface there, which is where you don't really want it. So a light pass with some steel wool to help remove some of that, and you'll get even more contrast, and that contrast is what's going to make that pop out more underneath the color coat. So there we go. That is essentially the effect that I'm after, and hopefully that will all translate through to a nice subtle panel line and rivet detail showing up after we put the color coat on, and that'll be next. Okay, as you can hear, I've got the vent on and I am in the spray booth, and we're getting ready to do some painting. As you can see, I've gone ahead and put a little bit of a mask right here in the front of the engine nacelle, and that's just leftover foam from like some Edward Brasson resin parts or something. That foam is stuff that you should always keep around. It's the absolute best thing for things like this. You can also see that I've got some silver paint on the front end of the nacelle, and that's just a little bit of all-clad aluminum that I sprayed on there so that when I'm ready to, I'll be able to do a little bit of chipping in that area. I also forgot to say that I augmented that foam that I used to mask off the engine there with a little bit of this stuff. This is my favorite masking fluid. You can get this stuff on Amazon pretty cheap. The only bad thing about it is that it goes bad after about 6 months, but that's not too big of a deal. Okay, the next thing that I do before I get ready to shoot this paint is a quick swipe with a tack cloth. And I've already done that, so no need to demonstrate it, but you can get these at any hardware store, and they're a pretty handy thing to have around. It's just got a little bit of a resin in it that picks up dust off the surface that you're about to paint. And I just keep one of those in my drawer in a Ziploc bag after I open it, because if you don't keep it in a sealed bag, it will dry up on you. Okay, and now I've got some paint that's already mixed up, and it is, hang on a second here. This is Tamiya's medium gray XF20, and I have mixed it with Mr. Color leveling thinner, which you probably know is a lacquer thinner. I've just mixed some up in this little cup right here, and it's mixed 2-to-1 thinner to paint, because I want a nice thin coat so that I don't lose all of my pre-shading work. So I'm going to put my mask on, because it is a lacquer, and it's a good idea to protect yourself from the fumes with lacquers. So I'm going to get situated, and then we will shoot some paint. Okay, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to just lay down a uniform layer, a thin layer over the whole thing. Okay, so what you can see there is that I just went ahead and spray bombed the entire thing with a nice uniform layer, and what that does is basically establish the basic color that I'm after. And now what I'm going to do is go back and just start shading randomly in different areas, and that will help me get even more of the medium gray color, but it will also help me get that tonal variation that I'm after. Okay, hopefully you can see that what I'm doing is trying to spray really small. And I'm kind of working in between panel lines and around different areas that I want to concentrate more or less paint on. So you can see the effect that I'm starting to build up there, where I've got a little bit greater density of paint in some areas than others. And I'm not really trying to establish any sort of a pattern, even though I am working between the panel lines, because I want it to maintain a random appearance. But you can kind of see how some of those sanding marks and panel lines that I pre-shaded before are showing through this color. Obviously, you'll also notice that I'm handling the area that I just painted. That's one of the beautiful things about working with lacquer thinners, is that it dries so fast that you can get away with that. Okay, I'm going to zoom in here and we'll take a little closer look, if I can get the camera to cooperate. It's a little bit tough to see because of this neutral gray and the lighting in my booth, but you can see that I'm starting to get pretty good tonal variation here. This is exactly what I'm after. One thing that I forgot to mention is you can see that I'm spraying really small. Even though I'm using my Iwata HPTH, this has got a 0.5 millimeter needle in it, and I'm spraying at about 15 psi. A lot of people might believe you can't spray that small with a needle this big,
but it really is a matter of just finding the right set of variables. It also helps that I'm using the Mr. Color lacquer thinner because not only does Tamiya behave a lot better for spraying small than a lot of other paints do, but the addition of the lacquer thinner, for whatever reason, changes the characteristics of it a little bit, and it just behaves so well when you use it this way. I mean, you can see what I'm doing here, that I am able to control that spot size really well. And I'm just kind of trying to be random. I'm working in specific areas, but again, just trying to be random, just keep that spray really small, but just work around and give myself as much variety as I can come up with. 50 shades of gray is what we're after here. Okay, now that I've got a pretty good overall level of tone on that, what I'm going to do is come back and once again I'm going to just spray on a really light additional layer that's going to kind of just unify everything. And there we go. Now that looks like it totally knocked down my tonal variation, but what you'll notice is that a lot of that comes back as the paint dries, and I'll have a fairly nice subtle effect. You can see that I did lose quite a bit of the shading in the panel lines, but that's okay because there is some still there, and I'm going to come back over those panel lines again anyway with some more different kinds of washes before this thing is all said and done.
Okay, so now that this paint is nice and cured out for a couple of days, it's time to move on to the next step. But first, let's take a look. Hopefully you can see here the tonal variation that I've been able to achieve with the way that I painted this. You can see that I've got some of my my washes that I put in the panel lines before still showing through, but in a nice subtle way, not too harshly. And in some places I lost most of them, but that's all right. Now, here's something that I've already done that I didn't really want to demonstrate on camera, mostly because it's a subtle technique that I'm still learning and I wasn't really sure how it would go. But take a look here at the tonal variation there behind the gear door, or the door that stays open while the aircraft is on the ground. And you can see there that I've got some nice subtle variety going on there. What I did is I sprayed a layer, actually 2 layers, that seems to be a pretty good number, of MIG Scratches Effects fluid right there. And then I mixed myself up a kind of a dirty light gray color. Something that I thought would sort of mimic that grime that collects on things from rolling down asphalt, highways, runways, things like that. You know, it's a mixture of dirt and rainwater and asphalt and just crap. And I feel like that there's going to be some of that behind the main gear wheel on an engine nacelle. So that's what I'm doing there. Now, the thing with chipping fluid is that the time, it's very time sensitive. I sprayed this on, and as soon as I could see that it was dry, I sprayed on the color that I had mixed up, and within about 10 minutes I was already working on this area. And I'm using a combination of brushes because the time you take, the brushes you use to knock that paint off, and I've got a variety of them here. This one I use for tougher scratches. This one I use for a little more of a subtle effect, and then this large one is also plays a role. Now, if I'm being kind of vague, that's because it is a kind of a vague process. It's just one of those things that you just kind of have to work and learn the subtleties of it. And I don't know that that journey ever really ends. I know I'm certainly not satisfied that I understand all of it. I just, I just work it. The good thing about something like this is that with this being a lacquer base, or this being Tamiya thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner as the base color, it's pretty solid. And I thinned the color that I wanted to use for the chipping with water. So it's basically just laying there. I know that sounds weird to thin Tamiya with water, but this is something that Mike Rinaldi is a proponent of, and it's something that I'm exploring a little bit because, again, how well the chipping works is completely dependent upon what you thin your paint with, how long you let it dry, what kind of brushes you use, and how strategically you spray. I sprayed a very light layer on there. In another area that I was doing on the bottom of the fuselage, I got a little too heavy-handed, which is easy to do when it's hard to see because the color differences are so small. I got a little heavy-handed on some of that, and I had a much more difficult time working with it with the chipping fluid. So, that's just part of the process. I can't really say enough that it's just very much a thing of learning to get the feel for it. Anyway, what I'm going to do next is start doing some panel line washes, and I'm going to be starting out with this wonderful panel line wash from MIG, which is this blue-gray. I was worried at first that it would be a little too blue for this, but it turns out that I'm using it in such small amounts that it's working fine. So I'm going to show you how that goes, and we'll see if we can produce some more subtle variety in the panel line and rivet detail. Now, one of the things, I've mentioned this before, I did in the last segment, that's a little bit annoying about these enamel washes is how quickly the pigment settles to the bottom. And that, literally within the space of 5 minutes, you'll go from depositing nice levels of color to depositing basically none. So what I have found kind of helps is that I just take some of it out of the jar with a stirring stick, because you really don't need much. This stuff goes a long way. So right after I shake it up, I take a little bit out of the jar and put it into a separate container, and that basically gives me a nice shallow little pool that doesn't dry out or doesn't settle as fast or as easily, and I can sort of keep it stirred up with the brush that I'm using to apply it. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and start adding some. Now I'm going to only do this in certain areas. Again, I want to keep things random and not create too much of a pattern, but yet still call out the details that I'm after. Hopefully you guys will be able to see that. I'm really trying to learn to work on camera, but it's much easier said than done, because I have to think not only about the actual technique that I'm doing, but whether or not it's showing up for you guys who are watching in an effective way, and on top of all that, whether or not I'm saying anything stupid, and that's always a possibility for me. So now, something that I want you to see here, hopefully I can demonstrate this. I mentioned this before, but I don't think I really showed it in action, and that's the idea of whether or not you're working on a gloss surface with these washes. Because there are certainly people out there who will insist that you have to do it on a gloss surface because it won't flow otherwise. Now, this is simply not true, and you'll be able to see it. Hopefully this is going to focus. Just watch here. Okay. You can see that it most definitely does flow along the panel line. Now, what you can also see that it's doing there is that it creates a spread. And that's the difference, the big difference between working on a matte surface like I am here or a gloss surface, is that the mineral spirits tends to spread like that and create those sort of broad effects. And you can use that to your advantage. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. The fact is that this is the way that petroleum fluids behave on flat paint. And mineral spirits is just a petroleum distillate that's very similar to things like diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, avgas. They're all kissing cousins. So it's kind of cool the way that you can get it to behave like a real fluid if that's what you want. Now, if you only want it to be in panel lines and you're not interested in having any sort of a spread, then it is better to work on gloss. So, like with most of these methods, which you choose to do is really dependent upon the effect that you're after. Okay, I'm going to go away and work on these gray panel lines, and then we'll come back and take another look and do some brown ones. Okay, so I've laid down about as much of the gray as I think I want to. You can see there where it's sitting there doing its thing. And now I'm going to add some brown, and what I'm using for that is this Tamiya panel line accent color, which is nice. I think it's really good. It's got a really fine pigment to it. And it also has this very convenient little brush in the top. Now, where I'm going after this stuff is in places where I want not only really deep shadows, but places where things would just be dirtier. So anything around and behind the engine is a candidate for that. Because, look, these things were leaky. Don't ever let anybody tell you otherwise. They were, constantly dripping fluids. You can even see this with aircraft that have been restored in modern workshops. That you get a lot of that. So. It still needs to be restrained. I mean, you don't want to just go crazy, but don't be afraid to fly that filth. And what I'm doing, again, is concentrating on areas that I feel would have picked up trash from the spinning main gear wheel that got slung off of there. So these little rivets that are on these gear doors, on the underside of the nacelle, just basically any place like that is a good candidate for a little bit of this brown. And I like the brown also because it's a little bit more subtle than the black that I'll be using for something else, which I'll talk about in a second. And it's, you know, it's subtle, and it may not show up on the internet, but if the photographs are good, and certainly to your naked eye, you will be able to see those subtle variations between, I mean, you can see it right there, the differences between the brown and the gray washes. And even though most of that's going to be gone when I rub it back, it does still create an overall effect that may not even be registering consciously when you're looking at it. It's just your brain kind of says, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. Now, this area that I'm doing here is directly underneath where you've got fuel and oil tanks in the wing. And so that's why I'm working only in this specific area. And that's, look, that's the thing with all of these effects, is to sort of, you know, be strategic and think about your intent. That's why I'm not doing a panel line wash in just, you know, like a black color all over the entire aircraft. Because while that certainly brings out those panel lines, it doesn't necessarily reflect reality. So it's just a matter of seeking that balance between what's, you know, what just looks cool and what represents a real aircraft in service, and, you know, all the vagaries of the elements and human interaction that cause those effects to happen. And it's also, you know, subtle things like choosing to work on a matte surface as opposed to a gloss surface, or choosing to apply a little more of this effect up here towards the front than towards the back. Just little things like that hopefully you're keeping in mind as you go through this process, and not just, you know, as somebody said once, just regurgitating techniques all over your model. Okay, now to what is my least favorite part of this panel line washes process, and that's rubbing it back. It's, you know, it's cool because that's what reveals the effect in all of its glory, but for me it's frustrating because I just don't ever feel like I get it right. I would love for someone to teach me the exact technique, but it ends up for me being a lot like chipping, where I just have to work it by feel. What I have found is that I want something that is both firm yet absorbent, and these weird makeup swabs, I guess is what you call them, seem to sort of, they work about as well as anything. And what I do is I just barely touch the tip of it to my mineral spirits, and so you can see I've got some on there, and then I sponge as much of it off as I can on an absorbent little towel, and then it's just a matter of just very lightly working these areas, and it doesn't, for me, it doesn't really seem to matter if I let the stuff dry for 10 minutes or 10 hours. I feel like it all works about the same. Some people might disagree with that. I don't know, but basically what I'm doing is I'm going to avoid the panel lines as much as possible. I'm going to, when I do have to go over the panel lines, I'm going to try and do two things. One is to just go very lightly and allow things to dry between passes, because what I don't want to do is be really working that and scrubbing it, because that's going to reactivate the stuff that's down inside the groove, and it's going to pull it right back out of there, and my effort's going to be wasted. The other thing that I try to do is work across the panel line, and also it's good to work in the direction of the airflow if you can, but that's kind of my last consideration. Mainly I'm just after making sure that that stuff stays in there. What I will also do, as you see there, is I'll use my finger some, because your finger is kind of absorbent. I'm not sure it's a great idea to be absorbing mineral spirits into my skin, but it's not much. And the important thing is that my finger does not go down inside the panel line. And so I'm left with a pretty good effect there, where the wash stays in the panel line and in the rivets where I want it to be. So I'm not going to torture you, making you watch any more of this. I'm just going to keep working at it, and we'll come back to it later. Now, I will say that the last thing that I'm going to do after I get this all rubbed off is I'm going to come back with a hard black panel line wash to use only in specific areas, and that's places like around the aileron hinge, the trim tabs, the gear doors, things like that are what I call a functional panel line, meaning that it's not just a detail that's been scribed into the surface, it's an actual moving part on the real aircraft. And I like to differentiate those with a black panel line. Now, what I'm ultimately going to be after is this. This is the other wing, which I've already pretty much done with, except for that black wash in the joints. But you can see where I'm headed with this. You can see I got some nice tonal variation built in there behind the gear door, looking nice and grimy there. You can see, hopefully it shows up on camera, I've even done a little bit of chipping on the front end of that. And just to say something about that real quick, because I didn't really mention it, what I tried here was what Mike Rinaldi talks about in his books, which is Windex chipping. Basically, his contention is that with Tamiya paints, and Tamiya paints only, even if they're thinned with lacquer thinner, that you can come back and reactivate that enough with Windex to be able to do some chipping. And I wanted to try that. It's okay. I'm not totally convinced. It was not easy. It was not controllable. And so it's definitely going to require some more practice before I sort of decide that it's added to my arsenal of techniques. But it is compelling because if it works, you could get a lot of control with it, and it sort of frees you from the chipping fluid ball and chain in certain instances. So anyway, that's where I'm headed with this wing. That's what I want it to look like pretty much when it's all said and done. Now, you may be wondering, why am I doing all of this work without the wing attached to the rest of the airplane, without any decals on it, blah, blah, blah? Well, there's two reasons for that. One is, as far as it not being attached, is because it's huge and unmanageable if it's all assembled. And I have a lot of work to do on these wings. Not only do I have to mask off the de-icing strips on the leading edges of the wings, but I have to paint the exhaust tip. And then, because the decals in this Accurate Miniatures kit have basically either turned bad or never were any good in the first place, but they won't even hardly come off the paper, and when they do, they disintegrate. So I've ordered a set of 1/48 scale Montex masks, and we're going to be witnessing me try my first attempt at painting insignia on here. So for all of those reasons, plus the more fundamental fact that if this aircraft were all assembled, it wouldn't fit in my damn itty-bitty spray booth. those are the reasons why I'm working on these wings without having them attached. It feels weird to me, but hey, sometimes that's just what you got to do, right? Okay, so there you go. Sorry, I know I repeated myself more than a few times. Sorry, I know I repeated myself more than a few times. It happens. I do this stuff live. I don't script it. For me, it's just a conversation with you guys. So apologies for that and my poor editing. But I hope you found this useful and interesting. This is what I was trying to get to from the very beginning, was a venue to just really talk about paint and weathering. So let me know what you guys think. If you if you see better ways that I should be doing it, if you think that what I'm doing is totally nuts, then by all means, just let me know down here in the comments. All right, guys, as always, I really appreciate you hanging out. Much love.